print media and its language is to this day still heavily relevant, no matter what anyone says. And so I refuse that print is not dead. Yeah, but it did die, and now print is undead, and it is shambling and infecting and thriving.
Hello, print friends, and welcome. This is a bilingual podcast, so if you subscribe to us, you'll get episodes in English with me, as well as in Spanish with Reinaldo Gil Zambrano. Together, we speak with people around the globe about their practice and passions in the field of print media and multiples. This episode is brought to you by Legion Paper. Legion Paper is a fine art paper company that represents the best papers in the world. They either stock it, source it, or make it with brands like Stonehenge, Somerset, Coventry, Reeves, Arches, and more. Legion is the best paper resource for every artist and printmaker's needs. Learn more about the variety of papers Legion stocks at www.legionpaper.com. Print friends, I am partnering with Print Austin to bring you an exciting giveaway. A 2-week printmaking residency in Thailand. You heard that right. 2 weeks making prints in a tropical paradise, eating world-renowned cuisine. You can apply directly through the Print Austin website, and I have an exclusive discount code for my listeners. Use the code PRINTFRIEND on your application, and it brings the fee down to just $25. Check out the link in the show notes for more information. My guest this week is Neil Daigle-Orians. We talk about being haunted, literally and metaphorically, internet horror, and how print is not dead, but it is undead. Hi, Neil. How's it going?
Miranda, I'm good. I'm sleepy, but I'm good.
Oh, me too. Thank you for juggling the time zones. And you are my first official interview since moving back to Thailand. We're back on the fringes of what can be considered a humane working day for both of us. So I really appreciate it. And I got to know you and your work when I attended the Mid-America Print Council Conference in Kansas this year. And I was lucky enough to see your presentation, which I thought was just incredibly creative and insightful. And I loved the way that you were thinking about print and engaging with it. And so I'm delighted to have you on the podcast for a conversation where I get to pick your brain about all the cool work that you're doing.
Don't you mean pick my brains? See, the joke there is that my presentation was print is undead, and a zombie is the joke.
It's a zombie joke. We loved it.
I'm honestly so excited to be here. So thank you so much for thinking of me and inviting me. I'm sincerely humbled and very just excited to share this with a different platform.
Oh, absolutely. I'm really happy that you said yes and that we're going to have a chat today. So let's get the introductions out of the way so we can jump into the print undead section of the podcast, so I always ask my guests, would you please tell us who you are, where you are, what you do?
I would love to. My name is Neil Daigle-Orians. I am the area head of printmaking at the University of Cincinnati, where I am also an assistant professor. And what do? I do a lot of things, mostly juggling, teaching, making, and sleeping. Sometimes eating is in there. But I would say my work is centered around questions of haunting and what it means to be haunted. And I take that to a very strange place sometimes where I'm talking very literally about ghosts. And then other times I'm thinking about being haunted by gender or being haunted by my library finds or being haunted by various aspects that we, I think, in this contemporary moment are being haunted. So I'm very much so invested in the archive as much as I am in anything else.
Beautiful. I want to pick apart every single part of that fascinating introduction because I love ghosts, I love gender talk, I love archives. I'm super excited. But before we get to that, would you also let people know where you grew up and what role art played in that early part of your life.
Yeah, so I was born outside of Chicago, Illinois, but when I was 8 years old, my mother moved myself and my two older brothers to her hometown of Omaha, Nebraska. So I grew up effectively in Omaha, and I have the 402 cell phone number and everything to prove it. And so I went to public school, and what I found out is different about private schools, that private school kids don't do this. When I was in eighth grade, they made us start researching careers. So they like make you start at a very early age. I found out recently that like private school kids just cannot relate to this story at all. So I don't, but all my public school kids get it. Anyway, so in eighth grade, we had to do this like research presentation on careers and what we could do. And at the time, the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies had just come out, the first one with Tobey Maguire. And so when thinking, what do I want to be when I grow up? I want to be Spider-Man. Unfortunately, that is not like a valid career presentation. Thinking about what Spider-Man is, Peter Parker is a photographer. And so I did research on like photography, commercial, fine art, whatever, did my little presentation. And somehow that entire world and exploration of photography turned into eventually graphic design. And when I was in undergrad, I found out that what I actually wanted to do is considered illustration. And I also learned that I'm terrible at drawing and I have no patience to really get good at drawing. And spoilers, a decade and a half later, I would finally find out that I have ADHD, but it wouldn't be until then. In retrospect, finding printmaking was such a blessing to me because it allowed me to do a little bit of everything. It allowed me to dip my toes in all sorts of different practices, and I truly consider it a very expanded practice and an expanded field. And so when thinking about why printmaking and why I fell in love with printmaking, I think it's because it allowed me to draw and paint and use photography if I wanted to, and also incorporate sculpture and all sorts of other materials. So I never had to sit still like I felt like I had to with other media and other practices. Yeah, it started with Spider-Man and now I'm here. So I went to the University of Nebraska Lincoln, where I got my BFA, and then I took a year off and eventually went to grad school at the University of Connecticut, where I got my MFA.
Beautiful. And I would love to just jump right in to talking about ghosts. And how long have you been haunted by them? How did that start?
Believe it or not, I am so heavily invested in ghosts and this idea of being haunted. And sincerely, honestly, it is a relatively new thing for me. It was like 2.5 years ago when I stumbled upon it. I'm the kind of artist slash educator where I really try, I don't even try. Naturally, my artistic practice and my teaching practice, there's such a blurred, thin, non existent line between the two. And my teaching practice and my artistic practice, they're constantly influencing each other. And so when I got to my current position at the University of Cincinnati, one of the first classes they had me teach was a graduate seminar. And it was a topical seminar for our MFA students. One of the first things we have them take, where it's like dipping their toes into art theory without getting into a vast array of critical theory. So whoever's teaching it gets to come up with the topic. At the time, I had been teaching, before this full-time position, adjunct at 4 or 5 different schools in Connecticut. And I was mostly teaching seminar courses about art and art-related topics for non-art students. And that's where my world of teaching comes from as a result. And so I had come up with this class idea literally based on, I saw a term posted probably on Twitter and thought, that's interesting. I better Google that. And that's when I discovered hauntology. And so I was like building this course for undergrads, and I get this job and they're like, you have to teach grad seminar. And I said, oh, okay, I guess I'll just beef up this hauntology idea that I have. Started researching more, started reading more. And suddenly there was just a day where it hit me there was this day, I think it was during class, where I realized just how important haunting has always been to me. And it was as if the
Mm.
ghost itself made its presence known, saying, "Hey, I've actually always been here, and you've always been interested in this." One of the other ways that I used to talk about my interest in print and where it comes from, and I still think this is true, but I think the ADHD story is more accurate,
Uh-huh.
is I grew up in an evangelical church. So I grew
Mm.
up very religious, and I was going to Bible camp twice up to 3 times a year. I went on mission trips. I played drums in the praise band. I was very deeply connected to the church. And when I came out in high school, I stopped going. And there's something that happens among especially youth and younger people who leave a church community like that. And it's this sense of loss, because truly a good chunk of my social life was in the church. And so now I didn't
Yeah.
have that anymore. And I used to connect printmaking to religion, in that, similar to religious ceremonies, practices, rituals, printmaking is utilizing tools and techniques and just different materials that have been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I am similar to when you take communion, or when you
Mm.
are doing whatever it is you're doing in church. When I take the scribe and I scratch away the ground, or when I'm wiping with the tarlatan, I am engaging in something that my ancestors did before me, my print ancestors in this case.
Mm-hmm.
So realizing that, and again, I still think that's an accurate way to think about why print came to me, but ADHD sounds more reasonable at this moment. Thinking about that, thinking about my past, yeah, ghosts just became so important to me. And not just ghosts, but also monsters. And there's so much to say about queerness and monstrosity, of queerness to monstrosity. So it just, a light bulb just went off on me. And I was like, oh, that's why I like spooky things. And that's also why I'm
Ah.
interested in history. And now that I'm framing it this way, what can I do with this? And that's where the real work that I feel like I'm doing now, that I feel is the most important work that I've ever done, is finally
Mm.
happening now that I've got this new framework. So it's brand new to me, honestly, in the grand scheme of things. I'm also very young. This being new to me is exciting and terrifying, but also I have so much time theoretically to explore it yet.
There's so much in your story there, and I'm already thinking about this idea, and I'm sure this has already occurred to you, but just to say it out loud, this idea of there being something fundamental about print and it being an after image intrinsically, that it's a transference in some way, that the primary physical object is gone and that there is what remains is the print. So what an appropriate medium for ghosts and hauntings. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And residue is a huge component of my research and my practice for sure. So all of those things just nice and neatly come into this like ectoplasmic ball of strangeness and fun and spookiness.
And also to connect a little bit what you said about that landscape of your childhood in an evangelical church, as someone who was raised really without religion at all, there's so much that's so spooky about the church too. And I don't think that traditionally evangelicals are really into the crucifix. I think it's that Protestant more kind of cross, but I don't know. But the first time I ever went to any church at all was with a Catholic friend. I just was curious because
Ooh.
it was like, what is this? And just seeing that massive twisted body of an almost naked man on the wall. I remember being like, what are y'all doing in here? That there is like a gore and a literal spirituality to that as well. And so when you were talking about what you lost and walking away from that in terms of social connection, my mind also went to that spookiness and that unseen world as well. I feel like could be found again through hauntingness and ghosts. Yeah.
Yeah, I have my actual hot take on all contemporary art is that all contemporary art is a response to what we are haunted by, whether we are aware of it or not. And that ranges from anything like I was talking about, like gender, colonialism, and imperialism, to modernism and aesthetics and all these things. We're in this postmodern
Yeah.
moment
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
everything is just reflecting upon itself. We're all in an infinity room of mirrors, and everything is reflecting upon itself and nothing at the same time. And I feel like we are just constantly chasing the intangible. Like art has always been about depicting the intangible. And whether we like it or not, my hot take is that we are all haunted and that we are all making as a response to that haunting as artists.
I love that. That's a full on PhD right there if you ever want to go down that route.
There was a brief moment when I started my teaching, my education practice, where I kept getting these seminar courses and nobody wanted to hire me for studio. And
Mhm.
so there was a moment where I considered getting a PhD, but at the time, a fun like side note of my research that is very important to me but doesn't really come out in my print practice as often is I'm heavily invested in specifically internet horror. Oh, you know that. You saw
Mm.
my presentation. I talked
Mhm.
about Slenderman. So
Yeah.
very invested in internet horror. And so I was actually looking at PhD programs that would allow me either looking into potentially even English programs and treating internet
Yeah.
horror as literature and looking at found footage in particular as a form of epistolary novel and looking at ergodic literature, but also looking at communication schools and looking at media schools. So there was a brief moment where when I was adjuncting full time and I was on the job market applying for full time positions, there was a moment where I said, okay, if I don't get even an interview this year, maybe I'll get a PhD instead.
Totally. That's how I ended up going to grad school as I graduated in 2008 at the height of the most recent financial collapse with an undergrad in philosophy. And I was like, looks like it's grad school for me. Long tradition of going back to school when job prospects are slim. But yeah, so you mentioned the work that you're currently doing and how kind of all of this is the backstory that flows into that. Would you take us on a little tour of what you're working on, what it looks like, and how it connects to all the groundwork we just laid?
Sure. Right now, my attention and energy is split between two very different projects that are both looking at history and looking at printed language as well as the falseness or I guess illusion of history and that events from the past do not impact the current day. Or I
Mm.
guess even thinking about the illusion of, oh, we learn from history so we don't repeat our mistakes, when in reality, everything repeats. And a haunting is a form of an echo. It's a repetition. It is something from the past coming to the present. And so a ghost in those contexts defies chronology. It defies time completely. Ghosts are time travelers. And so my main print practice right now is very invested in intaglio and etching. As an artist in general, I consider myself not material specific, but material sensitive. So when using and choosing materials and processes and techniques, the final object or the outcome for me has to somehow relate to the idea that I'm working with. So for the longest time, intaglio, my true first love, was impossible for me to connect to what I was making. I was doing a lot of work previously, years ago, grad school, and a little bit beyond. I was doing a lot of work about my body and queerness and masculinity. And so I was screen printing onto fabric and making pillows and sculptural objects because that just made the most sense for what I was talking about. And an etching wouldn't communicate that same idea. But now I'm looking at history through print media. So a lot of my research is actually through, at the moment, the New York Times archive and looking at news stories. I completed a book earlier this year called Blood and Sweat, which I took a single zinc plate and made it go through 10 different state changes. And in each state change, I was using imagery and text from various New York Times articles about HIV and AIDS, starting with not the first story about AIDS, but an early story about AIDS. And as I kept going, the plate was deteriorating, even though I was scraping and burnishing and trying to get it to a really nice, flat enough surface to then put more imagery on. It would deteriorate the texture. It would become difficult and illegible. And yet the trace of the previous state continued on. And so it wasn't a literal ghost print in the sense of how we think of it as printmakers. And yet it was a print that had its ghosts. It was a print that was haunted by the state previous. So the imagery of it and the text combines these stories that jump in chronology. So I have stories from the 80s and 90s, but I also have stories from 2023. And I have stories from much later, because we look at HIV and AIDS as a problem of the past, especially in America. And yet a lot of marginalized communities, especially people of color and people in the South, still have and face HIV rates that are as high as when it was considered an epidemic. And so looking at history and where we come from, and then looking at things that we consider issues of the past or maybe moments of absurdity, and then comparing them to, actually, we still think this way, or actually, this is still a problem. So right now, I'm looking at a lot of anti-trans and anti-queer legislation that is being passed, and it to historic sodomy laws and historic stories about things like that, about queer people being fired for their identity. There was a practice at one point where they would raid a gay bar, and once the identities of mostly these men and also some women were put out there, they would actually publish their names, which would then lead to them just getting fired and other ramifications, economic violence and whatnot. That's where I'm at right now. And I'm also doing research on, because I'm in Cincinnati, I'm doing research on the Mapplethorpe trial and other forms of how queerness has been historically criminalized, and comparing it to contemporary ways that is happening. This is a project that kind of sat on the back burner for a little bit until very recently, believe it or not. Recent events made me feel that this was very important for me to continue working on. So that's my one project that's very heavily print associated. And technically, intaglio wouldn't technically be the proper process. Technically, I should be doing litho, because lithography is how newspapers are printed. But the actual physical labor of scraping and burnishing the plate that I do for state changes, to me, is my way of imbuing physical labor into the process beyond the research. And it is such a physical, visceral process of scraping, burnishing, etching, rinse and repeat. And the state change becomes a moment of narrative for me, as well as literally just, God, the metal shavings, they're everywhere. And I also, to get the imagery onto the plate to begin with, I either screen print a negative image onto the plate, or I recently started doing paper lithography to get big ground transferred onto the plate, and that's working. So I'm also going out of my way to use non-efficient technology to get this imagery onto the plate. I could look at Imagon, I could do photo etching, I could do all these other things. And instead I'm like, Or I could just make a screen and I'll print my one little print with my screen, which is the least efficient thing I could do. And I don't know, something about that process, just like the fact that I'm taking so much time, even though I know I could do it more efficiently, it's almost as if time also becomes a material for me. In that.
Yeah, and what you're saying about that, like maybe technically it should be litho, it's a very literal interpretation. And the work that you're talking about, I think that with using Intellion, and with the plate in its transformation that happens through the process, the end aesthetic result to me looks like old microfiche and microfilm
Oh
from
yeah.
from the old days of libraries, which I don't even know. Yeah, I don't even know how many people listening would remember that, going and getting a piece of film and loading it into the machine, and that, like, that sound of it going through. But that's part of what, like, it really, having had that experience being born in the early 80s as I was, having experienced that a lot pre-internet library experiences. So that feels like it brings an aesthetic and almost a bodily memory of archive research, when archive research had a real physicality to it that I don't think is necessarily always associated now with research. Yeah.
Yeah, I for this current research project I've been doing, the New York Times has scans of all of their old newspapers, but most of them are like scans of microfiche. And so
Nice.
they have that Xerox quality where
Yeah.
the imagery is super degraded. And then there's also this weird translation thing that I'm doing where I'm taking this imagery, translating it to a screen, and then putting that on a plate and then etching that. So there's this like triple kind of translation between the original offset print and then this digital image, which then becomes digitized even further before becoming it's this whole like cycle of process. And then with the newer stories that I'm looking at, they don't have scans of their pages. They just have effectively a blog post. And so what I've been doing is I've been formatting the text and images in the same way that I'm finding them in the archive. And then I find that whole digitization to plate to print makes it match. It degrades the image in a similar way that the microfiche did. And so I don't even have to try. I don't even have to try
Mm.
to make a visual comparison between the history and the contemporary. It just happens as a result of the process and the image degradation. And it's just interesting and fascinating to see happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like it speaks to what you were saying about the circular nature of things and history as a linear narrative of things just changing and not looking back and somehow improving. I think is a big part of that too, that we tell the story of the arch of time, the march of time makes sense, and it goes forward, and it's going to be okay because we're all heading towards something better than what was behind us. All of that, I think, by creating contemporary work that has all of those elements that you were just speaking of that harken back, it really pulls you back in time and creates that loop that I think it sounds like is of interest to you, of seeing time and narrative and history as more circular than linear. Yeah.
A more cynical way that I like to put it sometimes is everything has always been terrible. When we come of political or social awareness and consciousness is very quickly, oh no, this image I had of the world is dissolving in front of me and things are terrible. And I think it's easy now, especially with mass communication the way it is. We think, oh, were things actually better 20 years ago? And no, everything
Mm.
has always been terrible. It's just now we're maybe more aware of it. Maybe now we're talking more about it and we're hearing more about it. But everything has always been terrible. That sounds so
Mhm.
hopeless. And yet I find like liberation in that a little bit, where it's like, oh, that means there's like potential here. If everything has always been terrible, that means I don't have to wallow in how sad it is that the election went the way it did. I don't have to sit here and be sad about that because there's a framework of people before me. It's something that I told my students the day after the election, something I told my students in one of my seminar classes, one of my undergrad classes. I was like, we looked at Felix Gonzalez Torres earlier this semester, and we looked at other AIDS artists. And I think especially artists making art about AIDS during the peak of the epidemic in the 80s and 90s, and looking at ACT UP and what they did is such a wonderful framework for us to look in this contemporary moment of finding joy, finding community, finding solidarity, and finding rage. And how, it's hokey to say, oh, we survived it once, so we'll survive it again. And recognizing that, no, not everybody will survive it.
Yeah.
And yet there is an ounce of truth to that. Yes, we did survive it, actually. And yes, there's an entire lost generation of queer people, and there's always the possibility that can happen again. And yet their ghosts remain. They remain. They are still with us, and we still cherish them. We still cherish Torres. We still cherish David Wojnarowicz. We still cherish all of these important, influential, radical artists and the work that they made. And we can find in their journals and in their writings, yes, there was sorrow and grief, but there was also joy, and there was love, and there was pleasure, and there was community. As, oh, wow, maybe we can do that too. If they did it, we can do it too. And so there's permission there as well.
Yeah, I think that's hugely significant. And there is a lot of hope in that, and hope in that idea that we can learn from the past. And I know that you're saying like this part of it is that we don't. We're obviously, we say recent events, we should. That idea that we're feeling grief and fear and maybe unsure of how to go forward. But there are people, as you say, who've been here before, and you can look to what they did. And that, I think that's extremely hopeful. And I don't know, a lot of my thinking is often informed about my experiences being an American who is living in a culture that has a much longer, richer history than colonial American culture. And seeing how, at least as an outsider looking in, how that affects day-to-day living, and talking with people who live here and are from really countless generations of people who have lived here. And anyway, all of that is to say that I feel like in other places in the world that have a longer history as a contemporary, so like longer through lines of contemporary society, and maybe one that doesn't center individuality so intensely as colonial American culture does, that looking to the past doesn't feel as novel, because it's something that feels like that there is a shared collective knowledge. So it's something that I think I have to remind myself of doing, but it's something that I maybe see more naturally in other places as well. And so there's something about the consequences of the history of the United States, which of course, but that also shows up in this conversation as well to me, and having it be starkly contrast against some of the ways that I see problem solving and this sort of long view in Thailand, which is where in the country in which I am an immigrant. And part of that shows up in often not having as huge reactions to the changing winds of policy and politics. You'll have people being like, oh yeah, man, yeah, no, politicians are always terrible. Like almost is like, why are you surprised? What are you doing? It's always has, always will be. But we can still make art. We can still make love. We can still live our lives, and we can still all go for a walk together, have a meal together. And I think that groundedness, I'm sure, comes from many things. But one of them I sometimes wonder is if it has this almost like a longer collective subconscious view of history.
That all that makes me think of is the concept of chrononormativity. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. And I have to be careful about my words because this is something my husband is very invested in, and I'm going to explain it poorly. But chrononormativity is effectively a system of normative structures that surround around somebody's life and time. And it's most commonly associated with milestones. So it is chrononormative to go to college at a certain age, to get your degree by a certain age, to get married, have a house, all that kind of stuff. And for queer people in particular, chrononormativity is we have a strange relationship with time in a lot of cases because maybe less so for younger generations than mine and older, but the notion of not coming out until your 20s and not actually dating until your mid to late 30s is a thing. And so even the notion of family and queer people having family looks a lot different, and the time frame looks a lot different.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you were talking about living in a land that has a much longer history, I was also thinking about how queer people have a very different relationship with time to begin with. And that is not a new concept. Like Halberstam and Butler have been talking about that for forever, and Munoz before them. But thinking about time and thinking about even just familiality and genealogy, it's hokey and it's so corny to say, but queer people make their own families. And so as a result, we have our own family trees. And as a result, we have our own relationship with this notion of community that isn't so familial in the traditional sense. And so I feel like our history is also disconnected in a lot of ways, similar to how the concept of America is only so young compared to a lot of other nations and existences throughout the world. There's something so young about queerness, even though it's always been present. The language is so new and is continually changing. And even our relationship with history is changing in that words are always changing and the way that we see people is always changing. Archival research is so fascinating to me too, because discoveries can be made in the most simplest of places, and it's from a book that has been sitting on a shelf somewhere, dust, and it's this library knows that this book exists and vaguely has an understanding of what's in it, but nobody has connected the dots between this journal and something else, or this person's letters and this other diary entry that they made. And they're just waiting for us. Those stories are waiting for us to find them and to apply them to our current moment.
Yeah.
I think you can really tell at this point my Vyvanse is starting to wear off because I'm just like all over the place, but it is making sense.
It is
My
making
dots are
total
so connected
sense
right now.
No, I'm right there with you. You've taken me on this journey. No,
Just vibing.
We're just vibing. I'm going to change that as the description of the Hello Print Friend podcast. You know, right now I have this very formal, like it invites artists to investigate or something like that. I was going to change it to Hello Print Friend podcast. We're just vibing.
Now that you're like out of an academic system, definitely do that.
Yeah, totally. Just vibing. We're just in Thailand, just vibing. No, good. So I really do see the through line so truly, because it all has to do with this idea of time and narrative and how we construct it and how we create truths around how we construct narrative and how the narrative is slippery. So therefore the truths are slippery, which is both good and bad news. Like bad news, nothing is true. Good news, nothing is true. So we're all free.
News, nothing is true. Good news, that means you get to make your own truth.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I'm here for it. I think you said that there were sort of two sides of what you were working on. So one was the archive and the newspapers and the history. Is that correct? And then was there another side? I would love to hear.
So my second project is out of left field, especially after that very deep and thoughtful conversation we had. But it does tie back to my presentation at MAPC. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm super interested in internet horror, specifically transmedia narratives through a DIY do it yourself lens, which internet horror just inherently is. And so I have effectively a project that is my own internet horror story that I have been
Mm.
telling for the last year or so. And it's light on the horror for the time being. But basically, what I've done is I've created my own fictitious historical society that collects various ephemera related to spiritualist and occultist practices. In reality, I've created all these objects and
Mm.
I am the historical society, but as a character I serve as the archivist of this historical society. And so it exists as a website as well as a YouTube series, which the first season of the web series ended sometime in the summer. And then the second season was supposed to premiere in October, and then October was terrible. So I'm aiming for December. But long story short, without getting too far into spoilers, basically, I have looked at research and created, I would say, an speculative history is the term I like to use for it, which is a bit of an oxymoron. You don't normally speculate on history, and yet here I am doing that. And so I'm looking at real events and real kind of moments in history and then inserting little things could have happened. And then as the archivist, I'm finding these stories and then relating them to the viewer. And all the while, my character is also me. It is assistant professor Neil Daigle-Orians. And so I'm blurring the line between what is and is not truth in a
Mhm.
very internet horror storytelling way. That is what they do. That is what we do. I guess I'm one of them now. And I'm trying to craft a story that basically just tells, it's convoluted. It's definitely, I'm trying to think of what I can and cannot say about it because I don't want to put too much information out there. But it involves a monster. It
Okay.
involves Victorian gay men in love with each other. It involves the Maplethorpe trial at one point. I'm making my own cartomancy deck similar to tarot, but it's different. I'm doing all sorts of things, and it all surrounds this monster that I've created. I've created a cryptid that I also occasionally dress as, and occasionally in Cincinnati just exist as this monster. And related to, because I'm so heavily invested in archives and the politics of the archive and what stories are and are not preserved in archives. And yet I'm creating a fictitious archive that is based on real research, but I'm inventing characters. I'm not trying to like create fake stories about real people. And yet there's something that I'm trying to reach for that is a truth. We don't have much explicit evidence of, not that's not true. We do have explicit evidence of queer people in the 19th century and
Mm.
early 20th century. They exist, but they don't exist as explicitly as I'm telling them. And yet I knew they were there. They were definitely there. Maybe not in Nicholas and Cyrus, the characters that I've created, maybe not as explicit as them. And yet here I found these letters that tell this sad story between these two men that's also full of love and joy. Also a monster. There's a monster involved, just trust me. So, yeah, that's where that project is. It's called the Lucinia Historical Society. Lucinia is one of the scientific names for nightingale, which is an important part of the vibe of the project. And it's my attempt at not just creating internet horror and being a part of that conversation, but also looking at horror as allegory. And so my monster is more than a monster. It's also an
Mhm.
allegory. It's also a metaphor. And it also gives me further permission to just mess around and play. And so I'm doing weird video stuff, and I'm doing strange performance, and I'm doing, oh man, I held seances in character. Have been researching all sorts of different spiritualist practices and devices, and now I get to make them. I'm making my own talking board, which is the more broad term for a Ouija board, and it is
Mm-hmm.
all based on this monster. And just having fun while also trying to put something strange in the world that is uncanny.
Mm.
Like, people watch my series and don't get that it's fictional.
Yeah.
And I like that until they get to an episode where it's like, wait, what happened there? Because there's a glitch that I put in purposefully in the video, and strange things start to happen. But it's almost too real to the point where nobody's watching it. But I
Mm.
don't care because I'm having fun. And I've talked to at least 3 people who like it. So there's 3 people who like it. And it also allows me to invent characters or to, again, speculate. So this is spoilers, but in the second season, it's focused on the Mapplethorpe trial. I did a bunch of research on the trial, its process, and the jury. And from what I can tell, nobody who served on the jury for that trial has since claimed to be a juror. So they're anonymous during the
Mm.
trial. And then jurors are allowed to, like, essentially out themselves after the trial if they
Yeah.
want to. And so, from what I can tell, nobody has. But what we do know is we know the gender makeup, we know the occupations that they held, we know a lot of things. And in my research, I found that one of them was an X ray technician. So I decided, you know what? She had a dream journal. And so I'm making her dream journal. And there's a whole story in there. And it's based on truth and yet also completely fictional. I don't even know if the X-ray tech was a female. However, I've decided she was. She was one of the ladies.
Yeah.
And she went to school for art, but then dropped out and ended up going into X-ray tech. But her friend stayed in art, and her friend did courtroom sketches. I'm making those courtroom sketches.
Amazing.
I'm playing in this space, and I'm having fun with it while also talking about the very real thing that happened in Cincinnati, which was an art exhibition, was a criminal trial. And there's something absurd about that. So yeah, maybe the jury was influenced by this monster that I've created that also haunted these 2 men in the 19th century, that also had something to do with an Ohio State Supreme Court case in the 70s. Like, this monster is just ever present in
Mm-hmm.
all these different elements of Cincinnati's history, and yet is not really talked about until now, because I've just found all of these things. It's, if you're familiar with Beauvais-Lyons' practice and his hoax, it's
Mm-hmm.
like that, but I feel like I'm doing something where I'm trying to come at it from more of a Stephen King,
Uh-huh.
as opposed
Yeah.
to, his whole work is all about like pranks and fooling, and there's a lot of fun stuff to be had there. However, like, I'm more interested in, but what if this was here, and here's the fake
Mm-hmm.
Cincinnati Register newspaper of this sighting from the 50s. And I'm looking at, if you've never been to the Mothman Museum in Point Pleasant, West Virginia, it is so worth it. It is so
Yeah.
good because they have all of the original sketches from the witnesses. However, they've been very poorly preserved, so they're all faded completely, but thank God they scanned them first. And seeing
Yeah.
how these people wrote about and drew their experience with the Mothman just gave me so much permission to just be silly with it. And in the same museum, not only do they have these, but they also have, here's the blanket that Deborah Messing had in the Mothman Chronicles movie. Who
Wow.
cares? But okay, it's important to
Just
Mothman,
throw it
apparently.
in. Just
Surreal. When I tell you, that was surreal, seeing like all of this genuine, interesting historical cryptid stuff. And then here's the brand of chapstick that Richard Gere, it's so goofy, but I can't get enough of it.
I love how like what you're doing is so related to what we were just talking about, this idea of Nothing is true. Good news. You get to make your own truth. And this idea that bringing up this Mothman museum and the fact that all the lore around cryptids is so squishy in its truth. And so you'd say, here's what we would think of as like primary source firsthand accounts. And then here's this thing that has to do with the fiction that was created based on this. And they're being displayed in an archive with the same weight to them is really interesting. And it just seems really related to this practice that you're doing, where you're taking historical events that happen to the extent at which we can reasonably believe anything has ever happened, and then throwing in all these other elements of it. And that is when you're talking about postmodernism, one of the catchphrases around our household is fuck the Enlightenment. Because I'll be like, that is when we all went wrong. The moment a bunch of dudes in Europe decided that you could know things, and you could know things from just observing them, and that you could come up with truths, like that's where things started to go awry. That's what we say here in the Metcalf Powshack household. And so it's just that this idea that there are these like hard knowable truths that then have a static form that is then immutable, truth with a capital T. Like it's just such a Western framework that then gets, just tried to put on every experience, tries to get put on every human experience. Has to fit in this because this is the dominant framework, when of course it doesn't. And so I feel practices like yours are so inherently subversive in that, in a way that's just so refreshing. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I find it so interesting that I've got one project that is like looking at historical quote unquote fact, or at least how it was presented. And then I have another project where I'm like, actually, no, I'm just going to make some stuff up. Both are as seriously invested in history as each other, even though one is more interested in like the official record and the other one's more interested in messing with the official record. They're both very serious about how they approach history. I'm very cautious when I'm doing my research, whenever I do incorporate real figures. In the first arc, the first story arc, I did some research on a woman named Laura Pruden, also known as Laura Carter, who was a practicing spiritualist in Cincinnati. And she was famous enough to the point where when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle visited America, he went to her for a reading at one point when he was traveling through. And so I incorporate her into the story, but I did it in a way that I tried to be as respectful as possible, because even though she was that famous, there's very little information about her. And I could find her gravestone. I could do that, but didn't. It's down the street. No, it's not. But yeah, like I want to be respectful of the reality and yet mess with it and play with it and speculate upon it. And it weirdly circles back to the presentation, what you introduced, how we met, where I put forth this argument that printmaking is undead, which implies that printmaking died at one point. And I do believe that. We'll notice in my presentation, I refused or did not tell you when it died, because I don't know when it died, but I know it died. And yet it has come back to life. And as a result is weirdly immortal. Undead things in fiction are very hard to kill again. And I feel like printmaking is that. Print media is this thing that was killed by digital or what have you, and yet came back with a vengeance. And we get to utilize this material and this practice and this medium to then comment on how the languages of print media are still relevant in our social media world. Just thinking of the term content and the term content creator comes from publishing. It comes from world table of contents. Hello. It's that simple. And so print media and its language is to this day still heavily relevant, no matter what anyone says. And so I refuse that print is not dead. Yeah, but it did die, and now print is undead, and it is shambling and infecting, and thriving in a lot of ways. It's like revel in its undeadness. Let's have fun with it.
And now it's hard to kill. I love that so much, because as somebody who's been in the print world for 12 years, the amount of articles, exhibitions, reviews in newspapers, blah, 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 that are around print media that start with something about this funny antiquated medium or this dying medium, or like that actually introduce the whole idea of whatever this print related thing is as being old and quirky or no longer relevant or basically dead, is it's a lot. And this is the way in which the general public is experiencing print and being introduced to it, like, constantly. And yeah, and so it's like these things, and yet here we are talking about it.
I don't know if this joke will be a little too early to make, but I just want to look at those like newspaper editors who are writing those stories and be like, do you think you fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all that came before you. And that was the printing press. You're welcome. Thank you, Gutenberg.
Yeah, absolutely.
And hundreds of East Asian and South Asian people who invented printmaking before the movable type in Europe. That also happened. Let's not forget. Let's not forget the Koreans and their invention of movable type in like 200 CE.
I have thought that the fact that Gutenberg really gets the glory, of course, is of course many reasons, including racism and colonialism, but also just the chance fact of English language having drastically fewer characters than the Chinese writing system, which was being used in Korea at the time. That's just it. It's just a chance. It's just the way it being just a phonetic language and having that finite number of characters made movable type as a viable way to produce content just more viable. That's it. So before we sign off, I wanted to ask you if in all of your ghostly research, your archive research, your seances, your collaborative seances, all of this, if you've had any ghostly experiences that would be interesting to share.
My Miss America answer would be no comment. My real answer would be no. I held seances in my studio at Malay Arts in 2023, which is housed in the original barn that Edna St. Vincent Millay built with her husband. And Edna was a practicing spiritualist and nothing. I will say I took a spirit portrait workshop once over Zoom where a medium was guiding other practicing mediums in portrait drawing and how when they're talking with spirits, how to draw their portraits. And it was less about the actual spiritualist channeling and more about literally, here's how you draw a nose, here's how you draw eyes, because these people weren't artists. And I was the only non-British person, and I was the only non-spiritualist medium who was there. And at one point, we broke out into little sections, little breakout rooms where two of us would draw and channel for the other. And apparently I drew somebody's dead grandpa. So that was cool. Yeah, she said, to be fair, it wasn't like, oh my God, that's my grandpa. So much as it was when we were talking after, she's like, well, that could be. Like, it was a lot of that. It was a lot of, hey, that could be. When one person found out that I was American, he started being like, this spirit is saying something about Virginia. Neil, does that mean anything to you? And I'm like, no.
Oh, no.
I'm not going to yes and this. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I've driven through Virginia. That's about it. But yeah, I haven't actually seen a ghost or experienced a ghost. I haven't even really had any, I can't explain that kind of.
Do you want to? Is that something you think you'd like to experience in this corporeal body, in this state, this plane of existence?
I'm so desperate for it. No, kind of.
Yeah.
I would like to. I would enjoy that. I think because I would like it, though, I think it won't happen, if that makes any sense.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I think I don't want to necessarily call myself a skeptic nor a believer. I am a secret third option where, whether or not I believe in ghosts or believe in spirits or anything like that doesn't really matter, because ultimately I do believe in haunting and I do believe in being haunted. Whether or not you want to call it a ghost is totally up to you. And whether or not you see a ghost is totally up to you. I think there's so much that we don't understand about our minds as well as the physical world around us, that to be completely shut off to the possibility of ghosts or other things just seems boring. Like, why not live a little and have fun? There's no
Yeah.
such thing as truth. So just make it up. Who cares?
Yeah. And this is like that fuck the Enlightenment thing too, that I think about, where I live in a country where spirits are unquestionably live among us. I have never met someone in Thailand who does not believe that and will talk to you about it and gives offerings to their spirit house in the morning. And the idea that this European framework is the truth, that again, that like immutable truth, it's just bullshit. Like, this entire country that I'm living in, just, oh yeah, all of these people are just wrong. That's so dumb. It's so dumb and closed-minded. You know what I mean? So I definitely think about it like that too. Yeah.
And not to add on one more asterisk upon an asterisk upon a conversation we're trying to end, but I do very much so live in this, call it Hegelian dialectic kind of world, where I hold multiple things to be true at once. And oftentimes those things are contradictory. And that's okay. That's actually what makes life interesting in a lot of ways. And that's the queer theory in me coming out, being like, oh, actually, there's no such thing as truth. And yet there is truth. Like, multiple things can be true. I'm constantly telling my students that, and they hate me for it. Like, maybe multiple things can be true. Maybe your perspective isn't reality. Maybe there's no such thing as reality, actually. Maybe that's okay. And from there, we just hold these two contradictory ideas to be true simultaneously, and then find like a deeper truth, not even in the middle, but just a deeper truth surrounding or orbiting those two truths.
I love it.
And maybe that's a ghost. Maybe that's what ghosts.
Maybe that's it. Is it's like that unseeable thing in the middle. I say both can be true enough that I had a friend tell me the other day he's going to give me an embroidered throw pillow with that on it for Christmas.
Maybe the real ghosts were the friends we made along the way.
And scene. Yeah.
That's the cold open right there. You're welcome.
That's it. It's done. It's in the can. I love it.
You are so welcome, Tim.
Neil, I would love to have you back on sometime. I feel like you and I are, I'm trying to think of some sort of like
kindred spirits.
Kindred spirits. That was it. I was like, I knew there's a word there. Yeah. I think you and I are kindred spirits, and we have so much more to talk about. And in the meantime, where can people find you and follow you and see your web series?
Yeah. So on pretty much every social media platform that exists, I am Neil Makes Things. That's Neil with an EIL. And that includes Instagram, but also my website is neilmakesthings.com. That is the best way to describe my practice. I make things. And for my web series, you can find me on the web, www.luciniahistoricalsociety.com. That is where you'll find everything that is currently up there, including all of the blog posts and all of the videos, as well as a whole bunch of fun Easter eggs and secrets if you like puzzle solving. And there's a lot of puzzles to solve.
Beautiful. I will put links to those in the show notes from our chat. And thank you so much, Neil, for this very fun conversation. And I really look forward to continuing to follow your work and see what happens out there.
Hey, me too. But also likewise, Miranda, this has been such a joy. And while I cannot wait to go to sleep, this has been so much fun.
If you like today's episode, we have a Patreon where you can help support this podcast and get bonus content like Shop Talk shorts with past guests. But the best thing you can do to support this podcast is listen, rate, follow, and share with your fellow print friends around the world. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing by Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you in 2 weeks.